I had been studying the language for years before traveling to a Spanish-speaking country. Before going to university, I had been studying English for 4 years. They had been drinking for hours when we got to the party. Before I went to the doctor, I had not been feeling well for days. He had been with the company for a year before being promoted. They had been married for 10 years before they had their first child. We had been planning the trip for months before we finally left. I had been waiting for him for half an hour until he finally showed up. "Were you waiting long before I came?" They will have been living in the city for 5 years before they move in. "We'll be married for 20 years before we retire." They had been dancing for hours when we got to the party. I had been working on the car for days until I realized I had missed an important piece. I didn't pay attention to the road and hit a tree. I had been feeling unwell for days before I finally went to the doctor. He had been with the company for a year before being promoted. They had been dating for a while before they got married. I had been studying English for 4 years before I moved to the United States. When they finally arrived at the hotel, my family had been driving for 2 hours. I had been working on that project for weeks until I realized I was going in the wrong direction. We had been planning the party for months, so we were very disappointed when it had to be cancelled. They've lived in that house for years, so they were very surprised when it was sold. I had been working for the company for 2 years when I graduated from university. By the time our plane landed, I could already speak the language quite well. I had been working for the same company for 4 years when I graduated from university. I had been living in the city for a year when I met my future wife. When we arrived in Madrid, I could speak quite well. Before joining the club, I was taking tennis lessons for a while. When I finally joined, I was one of the better players. I had been studying English for 6 months before I moved to the United States. I had been working on that project for weeks until I realized it was a lost case. When I graduated from college, I had been working on my degree for 6 years. I had been saving up for a new car for months before finally buying one. "I've been trying to reach you for days, but I couldn't reach you." We had been planning the party for weeks but had to cancel at the last minute. When I graduated from college, I had been working in my field for 3 years. I had been studying English for 5 years before I moved to the United States. My parents were married for 30 years before they divorced. I worked for that company for 10 years before it went bankrupt. During this time, I was practicing speaking and writing as often as I could. I was making progress but still had a lot to learn. When I came to the USA, I could communicate with people, but my grammar was not perfect. By the time we arrived in Madrid, I could speak quite fluently. I had been working on the project for weeks until I realized I was going in the wrong direction. They had lived in the city for a long time before they decided to move to the suburbs. We had been planning the trip for months before we finally booked the tickets. I was working on the project for hours until I realized I had made a mistake. We had been planning the party for weeks until we finally decided on a date. I had been working on the project for weeks until I realized I was going in the wrong direction. My family had been driving for 2 hours before stopping for gas. I had been at my job for 6 months before I was promoted. My sister had been taking piano lessons for 3 years before she quit. I had been living in my apartment for 8 months before I got a pet. My family has lived in poverty for generations. I had been working for that company for 10 years when they shrunk. I had been studying the language for years before I ever visited the country. I had been working on the language for several years before traveling to a Spanish-speaking country. They didn't get along for months before they finally got divorced. I was working on the project for hours until I realized I had made a mistake. We had been planning the trip for weeks before we finally left. They lived in the city for years before moving to the suburbs. I had been taking guitar lessons for 6 months before I joined the band. When we arrived at the restaurant, they had been waiting for us for over an hour. I had been working on the project for weeks and was finally starting to see some progress. They had been driving for hours when the sun came up. We had been waiting for over an hour when the power finally went out. Did you study French before moving to Paris? They had been playing tennis for hours before finally stopping. They had been driving for hours before finally stopping for a break. She had been cooking for hours until she finally started to get hungry. We had been waiting for the bus for half an hour until we finally decided to walk. I had been studying for the exam for days but still failed. They had been planning the trip for months but had to cancel due to a family emergency. I was hoping to get a promotion, but my boss said I needed to improve my job first. He had wanted to buy a new car for years but finally decided to stay in his old car. We were hoping to go on vacation this year, but we couldn't afford it. When I was in high school, I had been taking French lessons for 3 years. I was working on my car for hours until I realized I was running out of oil. They didn't get along for months until they finally decided to divorce. I was working on the car for hours until I realized I had missed an important part. He had been taking care of his sick mother for weeks before finally taking a break. We had been planning the party for months until we finally found the perfect venue. They argued for hours until they finally came to an agreement. I had been feeling unwell for weeks before I finally went to the doctor. He had been taking care of his sick mother for months before finally taking a break. After planning their trip for years, they finally dived and bought the tickets. I had been working on my novel for months before I finally showed it to anyone. Were you drinking before going to sleep? I hadn't felt well all day, so I went to bed early. They haven't been getting along very well lately. Examples. I had been studying English for 2 years before I moved to the United States. They had lived in New York for 6 months before moving to Los Angeles. I worked for that company for 3 years before I was promoted. I had been eating healthy for 2 weeks before I got sick. We had been planning the party for weeks before it was finally canceled. I had been running for 30 minutes before stopping to rest. He had been studying for the exam all week before finally getting in. They had been dating for a year before getting married. We had been working on the project for months before finally finishing it. I hadn't paid attention to the news. so I didn't know about the hurricane until it was almost upon us. He says he's been feeling a little bad lately. I've been working on that project for weeks, so I was really upset when it got cancelled. They've been dating for a while but haven't seen each other much lately. We weren't planning to go out tonight, but then our friends called and invited us to join them. They had been working on the project for months before realizing it was a lost case. We had been planning the trip for years before we finally took the plunge and booked our tickets. I had been hoping to hear from him for weeks before I finally gave up and looked for him myself. I hadn't paid attention to the conversation, so I had no idea what they were talking about. I've been working on my car for hours but still couldn't get it to start. They've been dating for a while but haven't been serious until recently. I had been waiting for the bus for over an hour when it finally arrived. I was studying hard for the exam but still failed. I hadn't paid attention to the clock and had been driving for hours until I realized I was lost. I haven't been eating much lately, so I was looking forward to my friends cooking. I've been wanting to try that new restaurant for weeks, but it was always too crowded. My little sister had been crying for hours until our family finally came home. I was studying hard for the exam, but still I was not very successful. When the plane landed, I was tired of standing for so long. I hadn't slept well the night before, so I was really tired. I've been working on the car for days but it still wasn't working. I had been traveling for hours when I arrived at my hotel. The flowers had been blooming for days before the gardener noticed. I was working on the car for hours until I realized I was running out of oil. I've been trying to learn the language for years, but I've never traveled to a Spanish-speaking country. Before traveling to a Spanish-speaking country, I hadn't studied the language for years. Did you study French before you went to Paris? They had not been getting along for months before they decided to divorce. He had been driving for hours when the sun came up. They had been working on the car for days until they finally got it working. I've been thinking about you for days before I decided to call you. We had been planning the trip for months, so we were very disappointed when it was cancelled. We had been driving for hours before finally stopping for the night. I had been working on the project for hours until I realized I was going in the wrong direction. We didn't get along for months before we decided to break up. We had been planning the party for months and finally had to cancel it. They argued for hours before finally stopping. He had been driving the same route to work for years before deciding to try a different route. They had been planning the trip for months before finally leaving. Were you drinking before falling asleep on the couch? We had been planning the party for weeks, but then it only took us a few hours to pack up. They had been dating for a while before finally getting married. I haven't been sleeping well lately. I had been wanting to try a new restaurant for weeks before I finally left. I had been working on my project for hours until I realized it would be finished tomorrow. I've been studying for the exam all week but I still failed. I hadn't paid attention and hadn't noticed that the meeting had moved to a different location. We had been talking for hours until we realized that we had nothing in common. They had been dating for a while before they decided to get married. I had been trying to reach him for days until I finally got in touch. By the time the professor finished speaking, most of the students in the room had fallen asleep. She has been taking care of her younger sister since her mother returned to work. I had not been feeling well for weeks before I went to the doctor. They didn't get along very well before they decided to divorce. I had been taking tennis lessons for a month before joining the club. He had worked for the company for 2 years before being promoted. We lived in the city for a year before we bought a car. They had been married for 10 years before their divorce. I had been saving up for a new car for months before finally getting one. They had been dating for a while before they got married. He had been taking piano lessons for months before giving his first public performance. They had been planning their wedding for years before finally getting married. I had been working on the car for hours before finally getting it running. When I arrived in Spain, I could speak quite fluently. They hadn't lived in New York for very long before it started to feel like home. By the time the professor finished speaking, most of the students in the room were dozing off. We had been driving for hours before finally stopping for lunch. They had been working on the roof for hours when the sun came up. We had been planning the party for weeks, so we were very upset when he said he couldn't come. I hadn't paid attention to the conversation, but I could tell that they had been arguing for a while. He said he was sorry he snapped at me earlier and explained that he's been under a lot of stress lately. I hadn't paid attention to the news, so I had no idea there was a coup. The company had been losing money for some time before it eventually went bankrupt. I had been working on the project for weeks. So when my computer crashed, I was really upset and lost everything. My friends had been planning the surprise party for months, so they were very upset when I didn't show up. When the trip came, I could speak quite well. I had been driving for 8 hours when the sun came up. They had lived in New York for 2 years before moving to Los Angeles. She had been taking dance lessons for years before joining the ballet company. We had been planning the party for months before finally canceling it. Luckily, I was wearing my seatbelt or I could have been seriously injured. He had been with the company for 10 years before being promoted to CEO. I hadn't paid attention to the clock and was surprised when my train arrived. I had been working on the project for weeks and was exhausted. I've been wanting to try the new restaurant for months, but it was always very crowded. I was hoping to hear from him soon, but I hadn't. The sun was shining all day, but as evening approached, the air began to cool. I've been working on the project for hours but still haven't made any progress. I was hoping to get the job, but I didn't. I had not studied the language for a long time before traveling to a Spanish-speaking country. We had been waiting for half an hour when the electricity finally went out. I had been studying the language for years before traveling to a Spanish-speaking country. Examples. They lived in New York for a year before moving to Los Angeles. I was working at that company for 6 months before I was promoted. I had been taking driving lessons for a month before I got my license. I had been saving up for a new car for 2 years before finally getting one. I had been planning my wedding for months before I finally got married. I had been trying for weeks before I finally saw results. I had been eating healthy for a while before I finally lost weight. I had been studying for the exam for weeks until it finally passed. I've been wanting a new phone for months before I finally got one. I had been waiting for hours before it finally came. I had been working hard for months before I finally got the job. I was hoping to get promoted for a while before I finally got promoted. I had been trying to lose weight for years until I finally succeeded. I had been trying to quit smoking for a long time before finally quitting. I had wanted to travel for years before I finally took a trip. I had wanted to learn a new language for a long time before I finally started working. I've been wanting to buy a new car for a long time, finally got one. I had wanted to move to a new city for a long time before I finally did. I had wanted to start my own business for a long time before I finally did. I had been saving up for a new house for years until I finally bought one. I had been planning my retirement for years before finally retiring. I was working for a promotion for a long time until I finally got the promotion. I had been trying to find a new job for a long time until I finally got a job. I had been trying to improve my lifestyle for a long time before I finally did. I was trying to get in shape for a long time before finally doing it. I had been trying to eat better for a long time before I finally did. I had been trying to save money for a long time before I finally did. I had been trying to reduce stress for a long time before I finally did. I had been trying to get more sleep for a long time before I finally did. I've been wanting to buy a new car for years before finally buying one. I've wanted to travel the world for years before I finally did it. I had wanted to start my own business for years before I finally did. I wanted to get in shape for years before I finally did. I've been wanting to eat better for years before I finally did. I've been wanting to save money for years before I finally did it. I've been wanting to relieve stress for years before I finally did it. I've been wanting to get more sleep for years before I finally did. I've been wanting to improve my lifestyle for years before I finally did. I've been wanting to make some changes in my life for years before I finally did. I had been taking driving lessons for months until I finally got my license. I had been saving up for a new car for years before finally buying one. She had been caring for her sick mother for months and eventually had to admit her to a nursing home. They didn't get along for months until they finally decided to divorce. When I came to the USA, I could already speak the language quite well. We had been playing tennis for a while before it started to rain. They walked for miles before stopping to rest. He had been with the company for 2 years before being promoted to manager. They had lived in Japan for 2 years before moving to China. I had been working on that project for weeks until I realized I was going in the wrong direction. She had been taking dance lessons for years before deciding to become a professional dancer. We had been planning the party for months before finally deciding on a date. They had not been getting along for months before they decided to divorce. He had been with the company for a year before being promoted. She had been taking dance lessons for years until she finally auditioned for a professional company. We had been planning the party for weeks before it finally happened. When the trip came, I could speak quite comfortably. They had been working on the project for months before encountering problems. We had been planning the trip for months before we finally booked our tickets. I had been thinking about moving to a new city for a while before finally deciding. I had been eating healthy for several months before I finally lost weight. I had been working on the language for several years before I moved to the country. I had wanted to learn the language for a long time before I finally took the plunge. I had been working on the language for a while before I decided to dive in and move to the country. When I finished high school, I had been taking French lessons for 4 years. When I came to Spain, I could speak quite well. By the time we got to Mexico, I could speak pretty well. When I finished high school, I had been taking Spanish lessons for 6 years. I had been working for 3 years when that company went bankrupt. She had been jogging for a while before she started to feel pain in her knee. We had been planning the trip for months, so we were very disappointed when it was cancelled. My friends have been telling me for months that if I want to improve my English, I need to study harder. I've been working on the car for hours, but it still wasn't working.